Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Justin, the other Justin, Jenny, and Emma have put together a great challenge for the last couple of weeks of August, the History Challenge. I dreamed up an enormous TBR, almost all of which I already know I will not be able to get to, partly because I've bitten off a personal project that I'm pretty excited about. It isn't really a booktube project, but if all goes well, I'll definitely talk about it a bit, perhaps in a weekly rambles video or something. Anyway, in addition to the History Challenge this month, I'm also participating in the Faulkner and August read-along, where we're reading The Sound and the Fury. Many of my fellow readers are posting fantastic weekly discussions and participating in a really active Voxer conversation, neither of which I have gotten my act together enough to do. But Faulkner is an author that always draws me in, partly because, by training, I'm an historian of the South, especially the Jim Crow period, when Faulkner was doing a lot of his writing. Although I'm not sure I'll get to the books I mentioned earlier in the month as possibilities for my History Challenge TBR, one I am very committed to is Michael Gorra's The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War, about how Faulkner as a person and as a writer dealt with the legacy of both the Civil War and slavery. The book is a combination of Civil War era history, early 20th century history, biography, literary analysis, and a meditation on the continuing meanings of race and racism, and the historical and contemporary portrayals of race and racism, especially by white authors. I'm very much looking forward to Gorra's book. Okay, the group of hosts put together a great tag to celebrate the beginning of their reading challenge, and today seems like a perfect day to answer the prompts. Let's get started. The first prompt: what first got you into history? There are two major answers to this question for me. First, my father was an historian who studied the development of slave cultures in rice plantation regions during the antebellum period in the U.S. South. He was researching his first big book when I was a girl, and it was published while I was in high school. I grew up talking about social and cultural history around the kitchen table, and I also had the opportunity to do everything from read first drafts of his chapters to help arrange his index, all on little paper slips sorted all across the living room floor, the way we did things back in the early 1980s. What I watched him do as a scholar was incredibly exciting, and he had friends across the country and later across the world who also studied social history. Many came to visit us along the coast of South Carolina, where we lived. Hearing them talk about history, about the ways they learned about the past by reading critically the 100-year-old letters and diaries, or scanning yellowed newspapers on microfiche, of poring over handwritten census records from another century, of interviewing descendants of the people who lived through that history. You'd think that my experience watching my father taking such joy and meaning from the work he did, and my experience watching his friends feel just as amazed by the work they did, my understanding that what those historians were doing had the potential to change how the country saw itself and to work for a much more inclusive kind of citizenship. Well, you would think that those experiences would have fully convinced me that history was something I wanted to read more of. But it wasn't quite enough. In high school, I absolutely hated my history classes. We studied names of presidents and military generals and their dates, and when we were lucky, their locations, but not why or how these things mattered to those people or to the people whom their leadership affected. Clearly, what my dad and his friends did looked great, but it apparently wasn't actually history, I thought. When I was 18 years old and a freshman in college, my academic advisor sat down with me to start plotting out what courses I might want to take over my 4 years in order to meet the school's distribution requirements. She suggested that I might try to get anything that didn't excite me out of the way during that first semester, instead of putting it off until my senior year. "What subject do you dislike and never want to see again in the classroom?" she asked. And I answered, "History." Following her advice to get my history requirement out of the way, I registered for a class on the history of race in America, discussing not only changing cultural meanings of race, but so-called changing scientific investigations into race over time. Well, the class was co-taught by a phenomenal scholar in the history of science and the absolutely stunning thinker Nathan Huggins. If you've read any classic African American history, you might know some of his work, like his book, The Harlem Renaissance, or Black Odyssey, about the Middle Passage, how people were captured and taken from the coast of West Africa and brought to the Americas, as well as the experience of slavery once the enslaved men and women arrived here. Note that both books are now many years old, and scholars have found new documents and additional primary sources, as well as asked lots of new questions that scholars in Huggins' era had not yet thought to ask. Still, Nathan Huggins was one of the scholars who started the movements toward the more analytical and inclusive way historians approach their work today. The key thing about real history, a thing Huggins knew, but so did all professional historians of his era and the eras before him even, is that it isn't history if you're just memorizing a list of names and dates like I did in high school. It's history, with its official definition, when you're trying to understand how and why things change over time. Basically, by the end of that first lecture by Nathan Huggins, I knew I would be seeking out other history classes. Many about American history, but also a few about medieval Europe, and one about sub-Saharan Africa, etc. I wound up being a history major in college and then decided to go get a PhD in history. I loved what I studied and learned during my education, and although I'm no longer a practicing historian exactly, I still love to read history, footnoted books full of historiography written primarily for academics, as well as books written for a broader readership. So I'm absolutely thrilled to see the History Challenge come up this month. The next question: what is your favorite history book or author? I think I'll choose Drew Gilpin Faust, although on a different day I might choose a different favorite historian. Of all of Faust's thoughtful and rigorous books, my very favorite might be her very careful biography of James Henry Hammond, with its discussion of the lives of antebellum Southern elites, exploring how they talked about hierarchy and what cultures they developed to ensure the continuity of their place at the top of the power structure. Faust's newer books, especially This Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War, are also really powerful, the latter talking about how the enormous death toll of the Civil War shaped the culture of the entire nation. The third prompt: what is your most anticipated history book you have not yet read? I've not yet read David Blight's new biography of the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and that is definitely one of the history books I'm most eager to read. And I might need to hurry. Rumor has it that Barack and Michelle Obama are producing a film adaptation of the biography, working with Netflix. Question 4. What is your favorite time period and why? What books do you want to read or have read about that period? I'll stick with Southern history here for a second, with its investigations of slavery and racial discrimination, as well as the impact of lost cause ideology, etc. My favorite period is Reconstruction, the period right after the Civil War, but before the period of so-called redemption, when white supremacy and intense violence against blacks came to the fore. During radical Reconstruction, not only did slavery end and Black Americans become full citizens, but Black men were constitutionally and practically granted suffrage, and the U.S. government used its powers to protect the newly enfranchised from threats from white supremacist organizations, all but killing off those organizations, at least in the short term. During those few years, 2 African American men became senators, and 20 served in the House of Representatives. Reconstruction was a period of real possibility for racial justice, and it always shocks me how few Americans seem to know about it. Of course, plenty of activists for civil rights have been aware of it, even calling the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 60s the Second Reconstruction. The period of Reconstruction, unfortunately, came to a very disturbing end, one that matters so much today as we try to construct a more just society that can go forward in union. Question 5. What time period would you like to learn more about? What book do you want to read or have read about it? I mentioned in the first question that in college and grad school I studied many time periods and places. Wildly, the history I know much too little about is British history. All of it. How could I not have studied British history in any more organized way? The periods I most want to better understand are from Shakespeare through World War II in the UK, when so much of the literature I love to read was written. Yes, from these novels I have, of course, picked up a lot of the basic picture, but I'm not nearly as clear on details as I'd like to be. I picked up most of the Peter Ackroyd series here and there, but I haven't read them yet. Is that a good place to start? Are there other good introductions you can recommend? Perhaps I need to make a plan to get started for this upcoming year. Question 6. What is your favorite person in history? What book do you want to read or have read about that person? That's an interesting question for me because I'm especially interested in social history, that is, the large-scale ways history changes over time rather than the stories of individuals. I tend to read about cultures and societies rather than intensive details about specific people. And then many of the biographies I do read are about people who had great power in society, but are not necessarily the kind of people one would call one's favorite people. Some were wealthy and politically powerful slaveholders, as in Drew Faust's James Henry Hammond, which I mentioned earlier. Instead of reading about them because they are favorite people, I read about them because they are people who affected the larger culture in an enormous way. Now, I say all that, but actually I co-wrote a book about an almost unknown person using his story to help talk through larger questions about Jim Crow. Still, calling him a favorite person doesn't feel right either. I'll think about this question more, and if I come up with any great ideas, I'll update this video in the description box. Next question. What history topic would you like to see more fiction or nonfiction books about? The books are just starting to really come out in larger numbers, but I'm excited to see more work about how the experiences of different kinds of disability affected people in a variety of places and times. I know all the answers are going to be really different. Even in my own work about 2 very similar places and times, and even the same disability, I've seen that difference. One book was about deaf children of primarily elite white Southerners before the Civil War, while the other was about a deaf man who was black and poor, wrongly condemned for a crime and institutionalized for 7 decades. The 2 stories happened within the same region of the country, starting in years only about 50 years apart. Both stories really illuminated not just the experiences of particular people with disabilities, but the structure of the entire society surrounding them. Disability is an important angle all by itself, but it's also a powerful lens to help us understand how a culture works on a much larger level. Okay, question 8. What non-book resources do you enjoy when learning about history? Well, from the research side, I really love reading diaries and collections of family correspondence, especially when I'm looking at the real letters in archives and not digital copies online, even though the latter kind of source is far more accessible, especially right now during the pandemic. If I'm not researching but instead learning about history for pleasure, I love documentaries. First, it's really cool to see some of my historian friends and classmates serve as talking heads. And I also really enjoy seeing documentaries about places and times I barely know about. Sometimes the subjects are easiest to approach when texts are combined with visuals and sound, as they are in documentaries. Question 9. Favorite history quote or fun fact? "The past is never dead. It's not even past," wrote William Faulkner, whose novels have echoes of history running all through them. And finally, shout out booktubers you enjoy who also read history. I'll name 2 booktubers who I can't imagine will still be untagged by the time I get this video up because they are so perfect for this subject. The first is, of course, the wonderful Peg at the History Shelf. Go check out her channel if you don't know her yet, and read some of her fantastic writing on Open Letters Review as well. And the other booktuber I'm tagging is Steve Donoghue. Both of them read very different kinds of history than that to which I often gravitate, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what answers they choose. Thanks again to Justin and Jenny and Emma for putting out this tag and this challenge. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.